All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's training. My name is Jay, and I'm here to talk to you about discomfort as opportunity in our relationships, particularly in peer support relationships. And I'm going to be talking about Pathways Vermont's relationship first practice. Pathways Vermont is where I work. So again, my name is Jay. I go by they, them pronouns. I'm currently the Director of Training and Advocacy at Pathways Vermont. And in that role, I oversee our training institute. Previous to working in this role, I worked as a service coordinator on a Housing First Act team. I've also worked as a peer support advocate at a community mental health agency. My background is in peer support. All of the trainings that I offer in my role are based in peer support. I also show up to this as a person with various types of lived experience, including being psychiatrized, having received multiple psychiatric diagnoses, living with intense sadness and anxiety. I was suicidal for many years. I'm also autistic. I think it's always useful to just name a bit about my own lived experience and how I'm showing up. Grateful to be spending time with you all today. Um, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have several slides I'd like to get through as we talk about discomfort as opportunity. Before we get started, I like to sometimes preface this conversation with a quote that I really love from Kai Ching Tom's book, I Hope We Choose Love, a trans girl's notes from the end of the world. So I'm going to read this quote to get us started. We must love ourselves. We must encourage love, love that is radical, love that digs deep, love that asks the hard questions, that's ready to listen to the whole story and keep loving anyway. Love for the survivors, love for the perpetrators, love for the survivors who've perpetrated and the perpetrators who have survived. Love for the community that has failed us all. We live in poison, the planet is dying. We can choose to consume each other or we can choose love. Even in the midst of despair, there is always a choice. I hope we choose love. This quote is really meaningful to me, and it really sort of underscores how I approach relationships generally in the world, and particularly how I approach peer support. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts or reactions to this that you'd like to share. Feel free to use the chat or even come off of mute.
I guess I'll react. I'll raise my hand.
Yeah, go for it, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nina, and I work with TSINY in Queens, New York. In hearing the quote, I think that love or I guess self-acceptance is really important in just living your life and living authentically, and also can help you have meaningful relationships, whether that's in the workplace or in your personal life, and just overall help you have a fulfilling life. So that's how I interpret love and how it can encourage me in my day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nina. Really appreciate that. Uh, in the chat, Casey says that they love that it implies that no one is disposable. Right. And I think that's what peer support is about, right? Is remembering that no one is disposable and also acknowledging that because so many of us show up to this work with our own lived experiences that we know what it's like to feel disposable or to have other people make us feel as if we don't matter, as if we're not lovable, as if we're disposable, right? And so part of the power of peer support is to regard ourselves, as you said, Nina, and each other with love or acceptance, whatever that word might be, right? If love is not the word that's comfortable for you, acceptance, compassion, empathy, etc. So I'd like to frame our conversation today about this relationship first practice I'm going to talk to you about, and more broadly about how we're going to think of discomfort is opportunity. And I think it's important to, when framing this discussion, think about what is it that we are responding to in this world, right? Those of us practicing peer support. Um, Folks are probably familiar with the medical model of mental illness, this way of thinking that is really pervasive across social services systems, including the mental health system. Under the medical model of mental illness, what happens is that the person is often identified as the problem, right? The person having the experience, they themselves are the problem. Mental differences, extreme states, other emotions, or behaviors are regarded as problems. And those problems require treatment, which may include things like risk assessments, institutionalization, medication, therapy, etc. The goals of these types of interventions under the medical model is to, quote, stabilize or normalize someone's behavior based on social norms, right? So based up on made up ideas of what it means to be a person, right? Social norms are not rooted in objective truth or reality. These are made up ideas about what it means to be a person. Um, because of these made up ideas, a lot of people are, coerced into trying to adhere to those social norms or adhere to those made up ideas of what it means to be a person, the right way to have emotions instead of, the wrong or unhealthy way to have emotions. Please know that I'm talking about all of this in quotes, right? I don't believe that there's actually a right or wrong way to have emotions. And yet the medical model does argue that there is. The problem with this, one of the many problems with this model, is that it locates social problems within individual people, right? Rather than taking a look at a person, really trying to understand their experience, the things that have happened to them and around them. Instead, what we're doing is saying this person is a problem. This person's experience of the world is a problem. They have a disorder or multiple disorders. The way that we deal with these disorders is through, institutionalization or medication or therapy or some other intervention. Sometimes these interventions, as we know, include coercion, control, and force, and also epistemic violence. For folks who are unfamiliar with the concept of epistemic violence, essentially what that means is denying people the wisdom and insight of their own experience, their own knowledge, right? When we're talking about epistemic or epistemology, we're talking about knowledge. And in this case, we're talking about self knowledge. So frequently, when people receive a psychiatric diagnosis, for example, what that involves is some sort of denial of their own wisdom and insight about their own experience, about the world. And this isn't limited, of course, to people who are psychiatrized. This happens in all sorts of settings. For example, an example that might resonate with some is, a version of epistemic violence or epistemic injustice is when Black women are not believed about their pain levels in interactions with the medical system, for example, right? They're denied their own expertise because of racism, because of misogyny. Um, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about epistemic violence is when an individual person is denied as being, um, as having their own knowledge and wisdom about their experience. Anyone have any questions about the medical model before we move on to a different way of thinking about this? All right, I'm going to keep us moving. So, ooh, the medical model, something that has impacted a lot of us negatively. Some people, of course, have felt served by receiving diagnoses or interacting with psychiatry, though overall, it is a model that has caused a lot of harm and injustice to many people. A different way of approaching the way that we interact with folks is the social model of disability. And this is the model that the Pathways Vermont relationship first practice that I'm going to talk about. This is the model that practice is rooted in, the social model of disability. Under the social model, we understand that the problem is actually an inaccessible world. No one individual person or their emotions or their behaviors is a problem. The problem is an inaccessible world, a world that feels really difficult to survive, a world that is full of various types of barriers. When we make this shift, we can understand that mental differences and extreme states are actually just part of the human experience, not the problem, and usually actually a response to a problem, right? Someone's sadness or anxiety is a response to something. It's not a problem that's innate or organic to that person's experience. It's something that they're responding to in their life. People are impacted by the things that have happened to them and around them, including trauma, grief, oppression, isolation, coercion, confinement, violence, various types of injustice. And so, again, when we're thinking of this, we're really trying to understand the context of someone's experience, the things that have happened to them, around them, what it is they might be responding to. This is a trauma informed approach, and it really asks us to center empathy, to connect with folks, to center people's autonomy and choice, and to really focus on mutuality, ways that we can share power in our relationships. The goal here is not to make people conform to certain ways of being. The goal is to make meaning out of people's experiences, explore possibilities for ways that, that things could be different if that's what that person wants for themselves, and ultimately to dismantle the barriers that are making the world feel inaccessible in the first place. Dismantling those barriers is a really tall order. Maybe it's not something that any of us will fully see in our lifetimes. And yet it is something that we have to work towards, right? If we truly want to show up for folks in a way that honors their experience. And of course, the treatments that I mentioned on the previous slide, people can still access those if they want, right? If hospitalization or therapy or medication, if that's meaningful to an individual person, they of course can access that tool. But the idea here is that those aren't the only tools and that they're not required. Anyone have any questions about this? Nina, please go for it.
It's not a question. It's just um, in thinking about trauma-informed care and what you said about centering empathy, sometimes I find it difficult to um, to do that because I have maybe I'm dealing with someone and I'm not understanding where they're coming from. Maybe their situation to me seems very just trivial. And sometimes I find it difficult for me to step outside myself and put myself in their shoes, or even just allow them to take up that space. Um, and sometimes it's difficult. So I guess I'm looking for some type of how do I step out of myself and do that consistently, where I am offering empathy and I'm offering that space for the person I'm dealing with to show up as they are. Um, and yeah, for anyone, for you or anyone that wants to answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. I think that's a great question. I think it's really important that we acknowledge in our work and in our relationships that we are sometimes going to have an empathy gap, that we're going to feel challenged and not really know how to be empathetic or compassionate or curious about someone else's experience, especially if, as you said, maybe they're saying, communicating in a way that doesn't make sense, or maybe even what they're experiencing based on your own experience feels maybe trivial to you, though isn't to them. And I think part of that really is the discomfort that arises when, maybe someone's going through something that just doesn't make sense to me, or again, as you said, feels like trivial by comparison. When I'm having that response, that's really about me, right? And so I've got to figure out what can I do? What can I shift within myself to better show up for this person? And that's in fact what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about today. So if it's okay, Nina, I'm going to maybe move through some of the slides that I have here. And I think that
Sure.
what you're bringing up will be answered. And if it's not, then we'll talk more about it at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to introduce this idea of the relationship first practice that I mentioned. Um, First, I want to look to the chat. Yvonne says, I find it difficult at work in inpatient unit due to clinicians telling patients that they need medication when I myself found other ways to deal with my diagnosis. Yeah, it is really difficult. I think one of the challenges of practicing peer support, of trying to provide support generally that aligns with the social model of disability, is that not everyone's on board, right? And many of us have worked or currently work in settings where there are folks who have more clinical frameworks, who are more coming from the medical model of mental illness, and really struggle to see other possibilities. It is really difficult to work in a setting where other people are struggling to see those possibilities, right? And Nina, as you said, the advocacy and support is so important in those moments. I think as many of us who work in peer support have learned, right, that peer support is not just about the way we show up in the relationships with people that we are supporting one on one. It's also about the advocacy and systems change that we do. It's about talking to people who work in clinical roles and saying, like, hey, actually, there might be another way to approach this. There might be another way to make meaning. It kind of sounds like you're closed off from being curious about this person's experience, right? Like, maybe sometimes we have to directly say that to folks who are just really not seeing people for who they are and not meeting them where they are. So let's think about what it means to meet people where they are and really focus on building relationships. So first and foremost, really centering this value of humanity, where we value lived experience and regard each person as their own expert. Each person's the expert of their own experience. And that does mean that, yes, even when a person is having a really difficult time, there's no way that I know them better than they know themselves. There's no way that I could know what they need better than they could know what they need. Even if they're struggling to understand what they need in that moment, it's not up to me to be the expert for them or to figure out, on my own what it is that they need. That's something that we figure out together. And that process really has to center each person as their own expert. Next, we have authenticity. And this is about really focusing on how we build connection in our relationships, right? We practice empathy, we practice compassion. So we're trying to understand someone's experience, trying to understand where they're coming from, honoring that their experience is what it is, even if we don't understand it. Also being authentic about our own experience, right? When we let people know how we feel about something, what we think about something. That's not meant in a way to change their mind, right? Just to share authentically about where we are. That that really makes a difference in relationships. Which brings us to collaboration, right? Thinking about how we center mutuality, mutual responsibility, and mutual support. Essentially, how do we build relationships that work for both people? How do we share power? How do we both have an understanding of what this relationship is? That leads us to humility. When we're collaborating, when we're sharing power, when we're being authentic, when we're regarding each person as their own expert, that allows us to be humble, to not come to to the relationship believing that we're an expert, believing that we know better than the person in front of us. And when we are able to be humble, practice that humility, then we can really preserve autonomy and choice and self-determination, right? Like if I'm not so focused on what I think is best, then I'm not getting in the way of someone else making their own meaning or making their own choices. In order to do all of this, we really have to center curiosity and hope in our relationships. We have to be open. We have to be curious, even when people don't make sense. Even Nina, as you said, when, maybe when someone's experience or problem that they've identified feels trivial to me or just not relatable to me, trying my best to be curious about, well, it's meaningful to them. It seems really important, or it seems like a very big deal to them, even if it's something I don't understand. So I'd like to understand more. And practicing this allows us the opportunity to make meaning, to better understand our own experiences, to better understand the experience of the person in front of us. It also allows us to transform, right? Allows us to change our worldviews sometimes, right? Like maybe I feel really strongly about a belief that I have, and yet through my experience of supporting someone, that belief gets challenged, and that's an opportunity for me to grow, to learn, to do something different. Also, practicing curiosity and hope makes space for transformation in the relationship generally, right? When people, are having a really difficult time in a time of crisis, maybe when other people seek to control them, seek to deny them their expertise, that doesn't really make it possible for that experience of crisis to be transformative. Um, what we want to do is see experiences of distress, of crisis, of tough times as opportunity, right? For someone to learn something about themselves, to maybe transform, to change in ways that they want to change. And in order to make that possible, I think this is the way that we have to build our relationships, right? If I'm coming at it as an expert, I'm not curious, I think I know what's right and best for someone, I'm just really not making space for the potential of them having a transformative experience. So, why is this important? Um, First and foremost, it allows us to decenter any sort of us versus them dynamics in our relationships. This idea that, people who are struggling are the people who are struggling, and that those of us who aren't struggling, that we're somehow different or separate. The thing is, all of us struggle. Even if we're not currently struggling, we have struggled before, we will likely struggle again. And the challenge of these us versus them dynamics is that these dynamics are very insidious, right? They show up sort of in all sorts of ways. Sometimes we don't even notice that they're showing up, and they can show up even in peer support, right? I think sometimes what unfortunately happens in peer support is that maybe if you are a person who's providing peer support and you're somewhere in your journey where you've moved through a lot of your tough times, you're generally feeling better about the way that you move through the world. Um, Maybe what happens is that you create some distance between your experience and the experience of someone who is struggling. The challenge of that, though, is that it presents this sort of empathy and compassion gap, and maybe sometimes has us slipping into, well, I'm doing better and this is what worked for me, so it's probably going to work for this person too, right? We don't want to slip into that because what worked for us won't necessarily work for other people. We want to remain humble. We want to practice humility as much as possible so that we can stay curious and open. That allows us to resist narratives of expertise and helplessness, right? That one person is the expert or has expertise and that the other person is helpless. This allows us to be trauma informed. A way that I like to think about being trauma informed is first and foremost recognizing that when someone experiences something traumatic, what typically happens is that they have a loss of power, a loss of identity, or both. If we're going to be trauma informed, we cannot take power away. That is first and foremost how to be trauma informed. We can't take people's choices away. We cannot take their power away because trauma is fundamentally about a loss of power. So the way that we practice being trauma informed is to restore power in our relationships and collaborate. Collaboration allows us to minimize coercion. All of this makes our relationships more sustainable. When we're not focused on being the expert, having all of the answers, we can just show up, be curious, be open, be realistic about our capacity in the relationship, right? I think sometimes people, not necessarily in peer support, though more broadly in mental health services, I think sometimes people do get into this work because they believe that they can save other people. The thing is, that's not really possible, actually. Like people are their own autonomous beings. We are all the captain of our own ship. It's not up to us to save other people, right? Instead, what we're trying to do is build relationships where we don't resent each other, where we're open, where we're curious, where we collaborate. And that makes our relationships more sustainable. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So some of this is just reviewing what we've already said, though I do just want to make sure we hit these points, right? So first and foremost, the value of lived experience, honoring that each person knows themselves best, that each person, even when in a state of, intense distress or a crisis, each person does have wisdom and insight about themselves, about their relationships, about the world around them. We really want to focus on epistemic justice, right? So we don't want to deny people their own knowledge, their own insight, their own wisdom. We want to make sure that we are trusting people, that we are honoring that what's real for them is real for them. Even if we don't understand it, even if we're not experiencing it ourselves, it is real for them and meaningful for them. And that leads us well to this concept of really valuing cultural humility over cultural competency. Some folks are probably familiar with this. There's been a big shift, I think, in the last decade or so in social services where for so long, so much training was focused on this idea of cultural competency, which is just bizarre, quite frankly. Like, as a queer, non binary person myself, I think it's really strange when, cisgender heterosexual people take a training about LGBTQI cultural competency and somehow think that they can emerge from that training having competency about my experience. That is absurd. They don't know what it's like to be me, right? Instead, what's valuable here is cultural humility, being curious, being humble, not assuming that we are ever going to fully understand the experience of other people. Because maybe we're not meant to, right? I'm not meant to have 100% knowledge or understanding about someone else's experience. And just because I can't get there doesn't mean I can't show up with empathy and compassion. Willow asks if I can define epistemic. Sure thing. So when we're talking about epistemic or epistemology, we're talking about knowledge. And so in this case, when we're talking about epistemic justice, what we mean is that we're ensuring that people are not denied their own knowledge about their experience of the world. Some examples of this, right, is that many people who receive psychiatric diagnoses are often actually denied as having wisdom or insight about their own experience, are told that they don't know what's real or what's meaningful. Um, Different people experience forms of epistemic injustice or violence when they go to the doctor, for example. Like sometimes different people aren't believed about their pain levels. Black women, for example, people who are pregnant often not believed about their pain levels, right? So these are the different ways that it shows up. And epistemic justice is really about honoring people's self-knowledge and trusting that each person is their own expert. Well, let's think about the power of connection. First and foremost, we know that empathy, compassion, and non-judgment can be really meaningful and transformative, especially for those of us who have not experienced empathy, compassion, or non-judgment. Those of us who've been judged for who we are or how we make meaning, who've had people feel sorry for us without truly trying to understand where we were coming from, what we were feeling, what we were thinking. There's also this acknowledgement here that authenticity deepens our understanding of each other. When we're able to show up authentically, to talk about our own needs, our own experiences, we better understand each other. And that really puts the focus on the relationship that we're building. Um, so much of peer support is about building relationships, right? It's not about a particular, in my thinking at least, it's not about a particular goal or objective or destination. It's about the journey of being in relationship with someone, figuring out ways to be supportive, in ways that are meaningful to that person and that you decide together, right? And in that way, we can understand that connection and focusing on connection in our relationships is more important than having all the answers because we don't have all the answers, right? Sometimes someone is going to be going through something and I'm not going to know what they could do to make it better. I'm not going to be able to problem solve. I'm not going to have the answer. What I can do is connect with them. I can validate their experience. I can be curious about how they understand the experience. And together we can figure out ways that I can be supportive. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you in the chat. Every journey begins with one step for sure. So let's think about mutuality in relationships. And I like to frame this as the relief of mutuality because I do find mutuality rather relieving. When we focus on having a shared understanding of the relationship, when we're focusing on co creating the relationship and collaborating, when we share power, when we share decision making, when we do our best to talk about our own needs and experiences so that we can minimize resentment, and when we are aware of power dynamics and how they show up, all of this feels like a relief to me, right? Because I realize I'm not responsible for this other person. What I'm responsible for is building a relationship with this person. That's what I'm responsible for. I want to pause for a moment. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts that you'd like to share? Yes, Howard in the chat, power corrupts. It does, right? And it can corrupt our relationships, right? When we begin to feel that we have a sense of power over other people, when we begin to use power over other people in our relationships, it does just make the relationship not work very well.
Can I share something?
Yeah, please go for it.
Hi, I thank you for your presentation. You know, one of the things that I found, as I call it, collateral damage, is by building uh, strong relationships where you said we're not responsible for them. And my favorite line is, "I have no idea what the right thing to do is." Really, it's really a good answer that I have. One of the collateral damages that I feel is, these relationships mean something to me, and over time, um, I'm affected by my relationships because the care is there, the empathy. I'm not saying one way should go this way, but not everybody travels a path that is comforting, and that's fine. But as a person, I care a lot, and so what happens is I get affected. They're well in some way, whatever their decisions are, but it's something that as a peer who has strong relations, who has shared decision making, and focuses on relationships, I deal with the collateral end of it, which is the feelings that may come about because I'm not leading their life, but I'm affected by it.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you naming that. And I appreciate that the way that you named that, the way you spoke about it, you really did acknowledge that that's about you, right? Like what you're feeling is about you. You're still honoring other people's choices and also recognizing that, yeah, you carry some feelings about it, that you're affected by it, that maybe you have discomfort about it. Um, and, I think one of the things that can be really powerful about that kind of discomfort or the way that we feel affected by the choices of other people is that it is really an opportunity to get curious with ourselves about why am I feeling so strongly about this? What's this about for me, right? Um, and yeah, I think many of us get into this work because we care a lot about people. We want to build really strong connections, and sometimes it can be really hard to watch people make choices that we maybe don't agree with or that we have some concern or fear about, right? And so when that happens, when we feel the discomfort, it's up to us to really figure out, yeah, how do I move through this? Thank you again for sharing that. And Jed, I think that brings us well to this idea of honoring choice, right? That like it's hard sometimes. And we know that it is very important that we honor people's choice, that we honor autonomy and self-determination, right? That each person has the right to make their own choices, to make their own meaning about their experiences. People deserve to have a voice in their relationships and the services that they receive and the systems that are designed to support them, right? We can learn this from the disability justice movement and this idea of nothing about us without us. We really focus on sharing power, doing with instead of doing for, being with people instead of doing to, right? So, really focusing on how do we collaborate and how do we bear witness instead of taking control. And I think that leads us well to, concepts of harm reduction. And harm reduction is really about preserving people's dignity of risk. People have a right to engage in risk. People have a right to make choices that we do not agree with. Many of us here have engaged in risk and made choices that other people did not agree with. That's our right. When we build relationships from a place of curiosity, compassion, empathy, non judgment, we're able to focus on reducing harm because if people feel like we're not judging them, if people feel like we are truly trying to meet them where they're at and not control them, then we're going to be able to talk more openly about their most challenging and vulnerable experiences. And just talking openly and having that connection, that does reduce harm over time. And allows us to really explore opportunities in our relationships and also, with the person that we're supporting, be curious about the opportunities that they might have, right? Rather than having a limited view of what's possible for them. First and foremost, I think when I think about exploring opportunities, it's important to remember that when we experience disconnection in our relationships, like when we misunderstand each other, misinterpret each other, when we're in conflict, when we hurt each other's feelings, all of this stuff's inevitable, by the way. It's just what it means to be human. We're going to hurt each other's feelings. We're going to misunderstand each other. That's just going to happen. And yet, what we have the possibility for when it does happen is reconnection, is coming back together, talking about what happened, trying to understand how each person was making meaning, and figuring out what works together, right? So even when we have a disconnect, there's an opportunity for greater understanding. I think it's important to remember that past harm does not equal future harm within our relationships, but also generally for the people that we are supporting, right? In my various roles where I've provided peer support and direct service, I've known people who have done a lot of things, including things that they were charged with crimes for, including things that they served time in prison for, right? That they were incarcerated for. Um, and yet it was really important to me to ensure that I wasn't thinking that just because this person had been violent in the past, that they were always going to be violent. The challenge, I think, when we see people as their worst mistake is that we don't see any other possibility. I don't know about you all, but I don't want to be regarded as the worst mistake that I've ever made. Um, I've struggled a lot in my life. I have hurt several people. Um, I've even physically assaulted someone before when I was really upset and angry and activated. The reason that I mention this here is because that happened many years ago. It has not happened since. I've done a lot of work to really understand why that happened in that moment and to really transform the ways that I respond when I'm feeling really upset, angry, afraid, and activated, right? And that's because I was in relationships where people believed that I could change if I wanted to, right? I think something else important here about exploring opportunities is this recognition that destruction and creation can happen at the same time and are typically happening at the same time. sometimes what we see when we're supporting someone is them maybe completely burning their life to the ground, right? Like they're exploding everything. Everything looks really chaotic and scary. And they might actually be making an effort to try and create something. And we don't want to lose sight of that. So I think a good metaphor here is like home renovation. Has anyone ever seen a room that's like being renovated? Maybe it looks pretty scary. There's a lot of like literal physical safety hazards going on. And yet that's necessary to get to the renovation, right? Like renovation is chaotic, it's risky, it involves literal safety hazards in order to get there. And yet that's just part of it. That's part of the process, right? So again, when it looks like someone is maybe, blowing up their life, as I have done multiple times, I have blown up my own life multiple times. And that truly for me was an effort to try to make something new, to build something different. And it's important that we don't lose sight of that. Because if we don't lose sight of it, when it looks like someone is blowing up their life, I think we can get curious with them. And instead of it being on how do we stop them from blowing up their life, we get curious about why why is this happening? What's going on for you? What are you trying to change? What are you trying to build? What do you need to be different here? Right? That allows us to be curious about that.
Jay, may I ask a
Yeah,
question? Hi,
of course.
Adam here. Um, about maybe the answer to this question was implied in some of what you said, and I've overlooked it. But what about situations where, and I realize that this will tread on some ground that is very distasteful to some people and gets into power relationships. What if you feel that you have a piece of information to assert to someone who's not looking at it, and like for example, I'm working with someone and their leg is obviously become gangrenous, and I express concern about it. They, nope, it's not a problem. Don't worry about it. We got to do this other thing. Um, you know, the approach I've taken is that, this is a mutual relationship. I am having an experience of concern, about that condition. I'd like to express d- carefully without still respecting the person and their choice. But I suppose it means I really feel like it's important that you put this into the menu of choices that you're making right now. Or can you just speak on that issue where I mean, I do, I think we overvalue expertise and stuff like that. But sometimes any of us knows something that another one of us perhaps doesn't, and it would be a value of that person to that person to know. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, I think for me, one of the ways that I practice mutuality is that if I feel like I have a piece of information or a different understanding than the other person, I'm going to share it. I actually think that's what is sharing power and practicing mutuality is that if I feel I have a piece of information that the other person doesn't have, I'm going to give it to them. In the case that you're describing, right? I think, I think it's a challenging scenario. I think that it's very important that when we have concern for someone's physical safety, like, something, someone is having an injury that is not being tended to, or a wound that's not being tended to, and it's becoming, to be infected with gangrene, as you said, like that is a really, really challenging scenario, right? And I think what I would practice is being really clear with someone about, like, I know that you've expressed that you don't have much concern about this. And yet, I do just want to share with you that I do have concern. I am worried about what's going to happen here. I'm worried that if this continues in this way, that you might not be able to recover from this wound or injury. Actually, I'm worried that you might have to have an amputation. And I don't know if you are thinking about all of that, though I do want to share that those are the things I'm worried about. And the thing is, I would express all of those things while also honoring that that person's still going to make their own choices. And Adam, I think it's actually useful to think about examples related to physical health because, outside of peer support, right, just across like the medical system, people do have the right to deny medical care. People have the right to go AMA, as they say, right? Like against medical advice. So people do have that right. And when we're in mutual relationships, I do think that it is up to us, as Willow said in the chat, that's part of being authentic, right? Is like, if I have a piece of information that I feel like the other person doesn't have, or if I feel really worried about something and my worry is partly that the other person is maybe not seeing the potential risk or harm and danger in what's going on, I'm going to share it. But the purpose of me sharing it is not to try to control that person, but to try to be in mutual relationship and be authentic about what's going on for me.
Oh,
I
great.
also honor that it's a really difficult place to be, right? When you see someone like, and your belief is that they really need some medical attention and that you're really worried about what might happen. And again, they do just have the right to deny that.
They do. Yeah, no, I appreciate what you're saying. And, the term that's often used is affording people the dignity of risk, which I so strongly support and which has been afforded to me and I've benefited from. And sometimes, I just see a real balance here. And I feel like sometimes in our wish not to, assert power, I've seen some neglect. And so I'm just really interested in that issue. And I appreciate what you're saying. Makes a lot of sense to me. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And what you're saying makes me think of, what we are saying here is like, don't take people's choices away. Don't take control away from people. What I'm not saying is be a casual observer in your relationships, right? Like, no, if we feel that there's something to truly be concerned or worried about, it is the authentic thing to share our concern and our worry. I want to go back a moment. Earlier, Samuel said, I think dignity of risk is better than right to fail, and is wondering how they compare to each other. I think of them as essentially the same thing. I just like the language of dignity of risk better. But when I think of dignity of risk, I do think of that as people do have a right to fail, a right to make mistakes, a right to try things and have those things not work out. Um, but yeah, I think it's actually been really important to me in my life that I have made a lot of mistakes that I have gotten the opportunity to learn from. It's been essential to my growth to have a lot of mess ups, actually. Yeah, I have folks talking about, not wanting to take away people's free will to choose. Howard talking about, using informed choice, right? I think that's part of why the practice of mutuality involves like sharing the information that we know, because when we share the information that we know, then people are able to make more fully informed choices about their experiences. I'm going to keep us moving here. So another way that I like to think of exploring opportunities is really thinking about this concept of impermanence that, sometimes when we're interacting with someone, sometimes when we're meeting someone for the first time in a peer support relationship, we're meeting them at one of the most difficult times in their life. They're in a lot of distress. They're really struggling. Maybe they're in a self-described crisis. Maybe they're in an extreme state. Maybe they are in what they might describe as something like psychosis. I think what's important to understand is that that person has not always been having that experience. They will likely not always be having that experience. Sometimes I think our fear response has us, fall into thinking, oh, things are so horrible right now. I can't see past this for this person. And I think it's really important that we both honor what's happening in front of us and also not assume that it's this person's permanent state of being. Because I think that allows us to really honor that people do have a capacity to change and be different, that people's emotions change, that people's states change. What we do know about the medical model of mental illness is that it actually often assumes that people don't change, that the best option is management, right? And that's why like things like medication are often prescribed uh, as ways to manage a quote unquote chemical imbalance, which the chemical imbalance theory is probably most or all of you know is not actually based on any consistent scientific evidence, but was a narrative created to sell drugs and have people believing that there was something organically or innately wrong with them. When we shift out of that idea, we actually do realize that we as individuals have the capacity to change and be different. That change is not typically immediate or easy. And yet, none of our experiences necessarily have to be permanent if that is not the way that we want to move through our life, right? And so, part of practicing this way is really just honoring the possibility for transformation, for change, for things to be different. In order to do all of this, right, to explore opportunities, to be in relationships in this way, we really have to tolerate and investigate our own discomfort. So, discomfort in our relationships is inevitable. It's a regular aspect of the human experience. It's a necessary component of peer support, right? Like, you might not feel discomfort in every single peer support relationship you have or every interaction that you have, but it is just part of supporting people. You're going to feel uncomfortable sometimes. Someone's going to be making meaning in a way that doesn't make sense to you. Maybe you're someone who is sober, and so other people's drug use is sometimes challenging for you. That doesn't stop you from showing up in the relationship, right? It's just part of peer support. When we feel uncomfortable, that's an opportunity for us to make meaning and to better understand ourselves and also better understand the other person. It's also, as we've been talking about, it's an opportunity for growth and transformation for everyone, right? Peer support relationships, we in these relationships, we really do recognize that it's not only that the person I'm supporting might have this experience of growth and transformation, I too am going to grow and transform. That is the purpose of peer support, is that we are growing and transforming together, that we are building relationships where shift and change is possible, where we learn different ways of being, where we make new meaning. It's important that we tolerate and investigate discomfort and even, I think, embrace it. It's going to happen. Why not embrace it? The importance of this is because it makes space for us to really connect, to practice compassion, to practice empathy, to collaborate in our relationships. It increases choice, it reduces harm, and also minimizes coercion and control, right? And I think these are things that we all want to do. We all believe in connection. We all believe in centering choice. We all believe in reducing harm. We all believe in minimizing coercion and control. And in order to do that, we're sometimes going to have to move through a hell of a lot of discomfort to get there. That's just what it means to be in relationship generally. It's especially what it means to be in relationship when we're supporting someone who's really struggling. We're just going to have to tolerate our own discomfort sometimes. Because the risk of not doing it, of not tolerating our discomfort, of not getting curious about the discomfort, values of misalignment, right? We're just not going to be showing up the way that we want to. We might begin to map our own narratives or ways of making meaning onto other people, right? Like I've got a story and I begin to put that story onto someone else instead of seeing them for who they are. Maybe I assume my belief or my worldview is somehow universal or objective when that's not the case, right? This person is making meaning in their own way. They have their own beliefs. Maybe I'm projecting my own fears onto other people. They might not be afraid of what I'm afraid of, right? I can share about my fear, but I don't want to make my fear the other person's problem. Right? There's a difference there between like saying I feel scared or you're scaring me and you need to do something different. Those are different responses, right? Another risk, and I think, this is clear from what we've been talking about, is that if we don't deal with our own discomfort, if we don't get curious about it, if we don't self-reflect about what's going on, we might seek control over the other person. And I appreciate in the chat this acknowledgement about fight or flight mode. uh, and how that can feel very strong. Yeah, I've been in places where that was strong for me too. Part of what we're talking about with discomfort is activation, right? Like on this slide that I have here. And I want to wrap up by thinking about the difference between harm and discomfort. I think sometimes, for many of us who have experienced various types of trauma, we can get a little confused in a scenario and maybe begin to think that something that's actually uncomfortable is causing us harm. But feeling discomfort in an interaction with someone does not equal being harmed, right? If I'm uncomfortable, then maybe I'm uneasy, I'm anxious, I'm fearful, I'm embarrassed, I'm activated, I'm maybe reminded of a past trauma. I'm slipping into that flight or fight mode, for example. Harm is when there's some true type of injury, maybe emotional, physical. Often that is deliberately inflicted by the other person. The challenge, though, is when we maybe, because of a trauma response that we're having, begin to interpret discomfort as harmful. There are risks to this, right? If we interpret discomfort as harmful. It's important to remember that when you feel discomfort in a situation, that's about you, right? Like I feel anxious, I feel uneasy, I feel overwhelmed, I'm being reminded of a past trauma. I'm sober, this person's drug use is challenging for me. That is about me, right? That's about my experience and my response to a conversation or a situation. I, in fact, do have power over myself. And this discomfort is an opportunity for me to reflect, to connect with myself, to connect with the other person, and to learn, to grow, and transform. Harm is different, right? That's about how the other person has wronged or hurt you or other people in some ways. And this sometimes results in punitive or carceral consequences for that person, right? When harm occurs, sometimes people seek to use power over someone as a response, or they punish them, they incarcerate them. That's why it's really important that we understand the difference between discomfort and harm, right? Because if we're interpreting something that's actually just a time where I'm feeling uncomfortable, if I interpret that as harmful, it could actually have pretty negative consequences for the other person. I know that we are just a couple minutes, I have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to go over a couple more slides here. You will have this slide deck. And the last few slides after this one are actually just questions for you to really sit with and investigate, thinking about your own discomfort. But first, I want to talk about authentic responses when discomfort arises. So it's okay to be authentic, right? You can be human in your interactions with each other. You can name your discomfort, they don't project it onto the other person, right? So if you're feeling uncomfortable, say something like, I feel uncomfortable with this, instead of saying, you're making me uncomfortable or you're being inappropriate, right? It's about, I feel uncomfortable when this happens. I'm feeling scared. I feel nervous. I feel overwhelmed, right? You're taking accountability for your experience and naming what's coming up for you. If something isn't working for you, say it. It's fine to say it. It's actually important that you say it because if you don't, you're likely going to build resentment in your relationships. Be honest when you don't have an answer. It's okay if you don't have the answer. Many times we don't have the answer. Be honest about it. You can negotiate expectations in your relationships. And finally, be honest about what you can and can't provide or do in your relationships. Be clear about your limits. Be clear about what doesn't work for you. Be clear about the kind of support that you do feel able to provide versus the kind of support that you don't feel able to provide. Nina, yes, I'll share these slides with Casey, and I think they will send them to all of you. So yes, you will have the slides. Um, and again, these last couple slides, these are questions that I'd really like you all to just take the time and explore with yourself. You could talk about it with coworkers, with friends, really thinking about the challenges to doing this, right? So thinking about the ways that you sit with discomfort, getting clear about what makes you feel uncomfortable, right? What has you feeling uncomfortable? How do you navigate discomfort? How do you resist treating people as if they're fragile? How do you resist defining someone based on their past experiences, right? Like, how do you do this? And then last, this is really thinking about our own history, biases, and judgments. Again, I'd like you to sit with these questions on your own time, right? And really explore them. Do you ever feel strongly about what people should or shouldn't be doing? Do you carry biases about quote unquote risky behavior, such as drug use, self harm, certain types of sex, etc.? Has your worldview shaped how you define safety and risk? And, is that getting in the way of you understanding someone else's experience? And really getting clear about how your own history impacts the way you show up in relationships. I think a great example here is like maybe someone's having a really tough time, and the way that that's showing up is they're yelling really loudly, they're swearing a lot, maybe they're throwing things around a room, but not near anybody. It might be easy to interpret that. It might be easy to interpret that as harm, right? And yet, when people are, having a really tough time, yelling, swearing, maybe throwing things that aren't actually hitting anyone or near anyone, I would argue that I actually just feel uncomfortable in that situation. I might feel that I'm being harmed because of my own lived experience growing up in a house where there was yelling and throwing, but that person's not actually trying to harm me. They're just having a difficult time and trying to move through it, right? And so that's why it's important to get clear about how our own history impacts the way that we show up and meet other people. Um, yeah, Nina, thanks in the chat. Be respectful, be open, honest, understand your boundaries. Howard, no judgments. Yeah, so thank you all for this time. I know we moved through a lot of information in the hour here. I do hope that sitting with these questions feels meaningful to you. These are questions that I sit with all of the time in my own relationships. Yeah, Regina, thank you. The only time you've left a situation was someone physically came after you with intent, right? When it was very clear. And even then, you tried not to hold judgment against them, but accepted that they had an experience where maybe they didn't feel safe. Yeah, absolutely. So important for us to remember that when someone is, uh, you know, having a really big response or maybe even beginning to be violent, that it is often because they don't feel safe. And how can we get curious about why they might not be feeling safe, what's going on for them in that moment, while also, of course, prioritizing our own physical safety, as you did, Regina. Thank you again for sharing that. Yeah, thank you all so much for the time. Again, I'll share the slides with Casey so that you have them. On the last, there's a slide here with some resources. On the last slide, there's an email here that you can use to connect with me. Please do feel free to reach out. Happy to connect with any of you. Thank you so much for the time. Take care of yourselves.